Most of us were taught that the New World was a vast, untouched wilderness until the Europeans arrived. That is a lie. Centuries before a single brick was laid in Manhattan, there was a superpower on this continent that would have made the kings of Europe tremble. Imagine a city that wasn't just a settlement, but a high-tech miracle. A metropolis rising out of a turquoise lake, larger and more populated than Rome at its peak. While the great capitals of the Old World were struggling with open sewers and the remnants of the Dark Ages, this city had paved streets, mandatory public education, and a waste management system so advanced it wouldn't be matched for another 300 years. This was Tenochtitlan, the Venice of Mesoamerica. So startling, the Spaniards wrote that it didn't seem possible in the real world. Today, we're peeling back the pavement of modern Mexico to find the ghost of a civilization that achieved the impossible and then vanished in a heartbeat. Forget the primitive myths. This is the biography of the greatest city you never knew existed. And before we begin our journey, I'd love to know where you are joining us from today and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to read through the comments and see how far these stories travel across the world, so let me know below. Picture this moment without the warm-up. You've been walking for days through rough country, following guides you don't fully trust. Then the land drops away, the lake opens up, and out in the middle of it there's a city that looks like it was placed there on purpose. Not a loose cluster of huts, but a real skyline, bright walls catching the sun, straight lines cutting across water, and temples rising above everything else. Bernal Diaz del Castillo is one of the men staring at it. Later, when he tries to explain what he saw, he reaches for the language of wonder because his everyday vocabulary isn't enough. And that's the key detail. His disbelief isn't only about beauty, it's about logic, about the way the place seems to break the rules. In his world, cities sit on land, tied to roads and fields. This one seems to sit on the lake itself, and the water makes it shimmer, so distance and shape feel unreliable. For a tired soldier, that can feel like a dream you're not sure you're allowed to believe. And when Diaz searches for a reference point, he lands on the kind of stories many of them knew by heart, especially the chivalric romances. He talks about Amadis de Gaula, where impossible islands and shining cities show up like rewards or traps. It's a small detail, but it tells you how the shock worked. They weren't just seeing a new place, they were trying to fit it into the only mental library they had. The approach makes the feeling stronger. You don't come in through a dusty gate on dry ground. You move over water with canoes everywhere. Not a few fishermen, but traffic. People commuting, hauling reeds, carrying stone, moving goods, ferrying news. The lake isn't scenery, it's a street network. Then you notice the causeways. 3 major stone roads reach from the island to the shore, wide enough for crowds, and they have bridges that can be lifted or removed. That's a quiet warning if you're arriving as a potential enemy. It means the city can close itself off fast. It also means movement is controlled, watched, and managed. As you get closer, the scale resolves into detail. Neighborhoods packed tight, canals cutting between districts, steps and docks along the waterline, gardens that don't look like gardens in a European sense because they seem to belong to the lake as much as to the land. And at the center, the ceremonial precinct rises like an anchor. It isn't tucked away, it's planted right in the middle, visible from far out on the water, a statement you can read without speaking the language. It's easy to get hypnotized by the view and miss the deeper point. This city is not a fluke, it's a machine. Even from a distance, you can see its parts: waterways, roads, walls, and a layout that looks planned rather than accidental. The people in the canoes aren't acting like they live inside a miracle. They're acting like this is normal. That normality is what makes the outsider's shock feel almost embarrassing, like walking into someone's home and acting stunned that it has a kitchen. But the shock is real, because order at this scale implies power, and power implies danger. Many of these men came expecting scattered villages and small kingdoms. Now they're looking at an imperial capital with confidence built into its geometry. First impressions can lie, though. This one lies in two directions at once. It can make the city feel unreal, like a stage set on water, and it can make it feel invincible, like something too deliberate to ever fall. The truth is more interesting. Tenochtitlan is strong in ways newcomers don't understand yet, and it's vulnerable in ways you can't see from a panoramic view. Start with the basics: food, drinking water, waste, movement, security. On an island, you can't pretend those problems will solve themselves. The lake will flood you if you get lazy. It will poison your crops if you guess wrong. It will turn your streets into mud if you don't plan ahead. It will carry filth and disease if you treat it like a dump. So a city here has to be a conversation with water every single day. Not a one-time engineering feat, but an ongoing discipline. That's why the Mirage feeling is misleading. What you're really seeing is maintenance made visible, routine made monumental. The canals aren't random, they're infrastructure. The causeways aren't just entrances, they're arteries, and they can become weapons. The ceremonial center isn't only spiritual, it's administrative and symbolic. It's where authority is performed in public until it starts to feel like nature. And there's another layer to that first approach. You're not arriving into a blank scene. You're being pulled into a political landscape you barely understand. Some of the people guiding you have their own grudges and ambitions. They want you pointed in a certain direction. The city you're looking at is the heart of a system that has demanded tribute, loyalty, and fear. So the awe mixes with tension, not because the place is mystical, but because it's clearly capable. And capability can be terrifying. The nickname that compares it to Venice is tempting because it gives your mind something familiar to hold, but it can also make you lazy. This city comes from different materials, different histories, and different ideas about how the world works. Still, the comparison sticks for a reason. Water isn't background here. It's the stage, the road, the boundary, the defense, and the mirror. The mirror part matters. A city on water becomes an image of itself. Images can intimidate, seduce, and confuse. From far away, the symmetry and brightness feel almost too perfect. Then you step onto a causeway and the spell changes. Now you're inside the system, and the system has rules, checkpoints, processions, order, and the constant awareness that you're being watched. From here, that first vision becomes a map. Each detail points forward to something real. The floating gardens that feed the city, the barriers that manage salt and fresh water, the aqueducts that bring clean drinking water, the market that pulls goods from far away, the schools that train elites and soldiers, the rituals that bind the state to the cosmos, and the hard, fragile fact that a city built to master a lake can also be trapped by that lake when the wrong kind of war arrives. So keep Diaz's stunned pause in your mind, not because it's romantic, because it's honest. To newcomers, this place looks like a dream, but to the people who built it, It's the result of decisions, labor, compromise, and relentless adaptation. And if you want to understand why it rose, you start by admitting it wasn't an accident. It starts far from that shining view on the lake, with people who don't look like future empire builders at all. The Mexica arrive in the Valley of Mexico as outsiders, latecomers, a group without an obvious homeland that everyone else respects. In the stories they tell about themselves, they've been moving for a long time, pushed by pressure, pulled by hope, and held together by a shared identity that hardens as they travel. They carry a promise that their god, Huitzilopochtli, will show them where to stop. Not a vague feeling, but a sign you can point at. An eagle perched on a cactus, feeding on a serpent. It's easy to hear that and think of it as just a myth, a nice emblem for a flag. But for them, it functions like a compass. It gives meaning to hardship, and it turns wandering into a mission. When they reach the valley, the mission doesn't suddenly become comfortable. This is a crowded world. City-states are already established. Land is claimed, farmed, fought over, and remembered. If you're new, you don't get the best ground. You get what people are willing to give you, which is often the place no one wants. And for the Mexica, that place is the marshy edge of Lake Texcoco. Mud, reeds, brackish water, mosquitoes, a landscape that looks like a punishment. Their first homes are not stone or brick, but simple reed huts, and the ground beneath them is so soft that it can sag and shift, so walls lean, floors dip, and nothing ever feels fully settled. The strange thing is that the punishment becomes an opportunity, because what others see as useless, they learn to treat as flexible. On dry land, you can be blocked by walls and borders. In a swamp, borders are softer. In a lake system, access is different. You can move by canoe, you can fish, you can harvest reeds, you can build if you're willing to do the slow work of making ground where there isn't any. The prophecy story and the swamp reality meet right here. The eagle on the cactus doesn't appear over a perfect meadow, it appears over a hard place. And that matters because it shapes the culture that grows out of it. If your origin point is the land nobody wants, survival becomes a craft. Pride becomes practical. You don't romanticize the environment. You learn it. You bargain with it. You start small in conditions that force you to be organized, because chaos on a lake is lethal. And the lake punishes individualism in a very literal way. If your neighbor doesn't secure his plot, if he's careless with how he anchors a chinampa or how he piles up soil and reeds, it can drift, tear loose, and slam into other homes like a slow-moving wrecking ball. On an island, you can't pretend you live alone. You're tied to the people around you by physics as much as by politics. Still, they don't transform into masters overnight. At first, they're clients and fighters for hire, caught in the valley's politics. They serve stronger powers, pay tribute, take insults, and absorb lessons. For a long stretch, they live under the shadow of the Tepanecs of Azcapotzalco, not just as occasional mercenaries, but as something close to vassals, expected to obey and provide labor and fighters when called. They learn how alliances work here. They learn that prestige is built by results, not by claims. And they learn that violence is a language everyone speaks, but it's not the only one. There's diplomacy, marriage ties, ritual obligations, and the constant calculation of who needs whom. The Mexica settlement begins as something modest, then slowly becomes more stable. People drive stakes, lay down reed mats, pile stones and earth. They build platforms above the waterline. They create paths. They dig channels. They make a place that can hold more people, then more again. This is not the glamorous part of the story, but it's the foundation. You don't get a city that shocks conquerors without decades of unglamorous engineering and social discipline. And that discipline isn't abstract. It's learned the hard way, through shared risk and shared work, until coordination starts to feel like survival itself. As the settlement grows, something else happens. The Mexica stop thinking like guests. They start thinking like owners. It's not just that they want to survive, they want to set terms. They build a reputation as formidable warriors, and in this world, that reputation is a kind of currency. Then comes the political turn that changes everything, the moment when they stop accepting the role assigned to them. The Tepanec grip weakens, rivalries open cracks, and the Mexica make the dangerous decision to rebel against the owners they've served. It's a leap from being used by the system to trying to run it. Later, this new balance will harden into the Triple Alliance, the engine of what outsiders will call an empire. But even before that bigger machine is fully formed, the mentality is visible. They are no longer simply drifting through someone else's map, they are drawing their own. The prophecy, whether you take it literally or not, plays a role here because it creates a sense of inevitability. It tells people this is where we were meant to be. If you believe that, you build with a different kind of stubbornness. You invest, you defend, you imagine a future on that patch of water. And the swamp itself, the thing that looked like a bad deal, becomes a training ground. It teaches them to think in systems: water flow, food supply, transport, defense. A marshy island forces you to solve problems that dry land cities can ignore until it's too late. It also trains you to accept structure, because without structure, your neighbor's mistake becomes your disaster. So when the city begins to rise, it doesn't rise despite the swamp. It rises because the swamp demands solutions, and solutions, repeated over generations, become power. The moment the Spaniards later mistake for a mirage is, in a way, the end of this origin story. It's the final visual payoff of a decision that sounded ridiculous at the start, to claim the worst land in the valley and then, patiently, turn it into the center of everything. So let's take the miracle apart and look at the parts. A city on a lake sounds like a poetic idea until you try to live in it. Where do you get fresh water when the lake is partly salty? Where do you grow enough food when you don't have fields stretching to the horizon? How do you stop floods? And how do you keep your streets from turning into a disease factory? Tenochtitlan answers those questions with engineering that's practical first and impressive second. The ground itself has to be made. You start with shallow water and soft mud. You drive wooden stakes down to create a frame. You weave reeds and branches between them, like making a huge basket. Then you pile on layers of mud, lake sediment, vegetation, anything that will build up and hold. It's slow, back-breaking work, and it doesn't look heroic while it's happening. But over time, it creates stable platforms. And stable platforms can become streets, courtyards, and foundations for stone. The most famous piece of this system is the chinampa. People often call them floating gardens, but that phrase can be misleading because they aren't drifting around like rafts. They're anchored, rectangular plots built in the shallow lakeshore zones, framed with stakes and packed with mud and plant matter. Along the edges, they plant aqueducts, willow-like trees that act like living rebar, their roots stitching through the silt and holding the whole structure together. Canals run between the plots, so a canoe can glide right up to the edge like a delivery truck. The water keeps the soil moist, and the farmers keep raising the beds, adding rich sediment dredged from the canals. It's a loop. The canals feed the fields, and the fields justify the canals. And the result is something that looks almost unfair in its productivity, because you can harvest again and again with multiple growing cycles close to the city without relying on long supply lines. That changes everything. It means a dense population can be fed locally. It means food arrives by water, quietly, constantly. It means the city is not just consuming the lake, it's using the lake as farmland. Now, zoom out. A city lake has another problem: water quality. Lake Texcoco is brackish. Parts of the basin are salty, parts fresher, and the balance shifts with seasons and storms. If you let the whole thing mix freely, you lose control. The chinampas suffer, drinking water becomes harder to manage, and the city becomes vulnerable to flooding. This is where the dike associated with Nezahualcóyotl comes in, a long barrier built to help manage the boundary between saltier waters and fresher waters. It's not a magical wall that solves everything, and it likely required constant repair and adaptation. But the idea is clear and ambitious. You can shape the lake to protect the city's lifelines. You can separate spaces. You can reduce salinity in key zones. You can slow floodwaters. You can turn a chaotic environment into something more predictable. Building a structure like that isn't just a design problem. It's a human soundscape. The splash of mud and water, the thud of piled stone, the calls of foremen, and at peak moments, tens of thousands of workers moving in coordinated waves, like the city is building its own armor. Then there are the causeways, the great stone roads linking the island to the mainland. They aren't just transportation, they are control points. They bring tribute in, they move troops out, they organize movement the way gates organize a wall. And they are built with breaks and bridges, which means they can be opened for canoe traffic, but they can also be closed in a crisis. From a distance, they make the city look like it's connected. Up close, they remind you the city can decide how connected it wants to be. Inside the city, canals do the heavy lifting. They're not decorative, they're infrastructure. They move people and goods. They also help with drainage, because a place like this can't afford to let rainwater and waste sit around. Fresh drinking water is its own separate victory, and it comes in through the aqueduct from Chapultepec, built as a dual line so one channel could keep supplying the city while the other was shut down and cleared of silt. For the Spaniards, that detail was a shock, because it looked like a system designed for reliability, not just for show. Everywhere you look, you see the same pattern, a network designed to turn water from an enemy into a tool. Even building materials reflect that. Stone and timber have to be transported. Heavy loads move more easily on water than over mud. Canoes and barges become part of construction, not just commerce. The labor behind all this is massive, and it's organized. You don't build dikes, causeways, canals, raised fields, and aqueducts with a few enthusiastic volunteers. You need planning, coordination, schedules, standards, enforcement. This is where the earlier social discipline starts to show itself as state capacity. People are being mobilized, not once, but repeatedly, over generations. Maintenance is the hidden hero. A chinampa that isn't maintained collapses. A canal that isn't dredged becomes clogged. A dike that isn't repaired becomes a breach. So the city is always working on itself, quietly, like a living thing renewing its skin. And when you step back and look at the whole, the impossible part becomes less mysterious. The city isn't defying nature. It's collaborating with it in a very controlled way. The lake provides transport, soil, moisture, fish, birds, reeds. The people provide labor, rules, and a willingness to think in systems. That's what creates the spectacle. Not a single genius moment, but a long, stubborn conversation between a society and its environment, until the environment starts to look like architecture. When Europeans later tried to explain what shocked them most, it wasn't only the temples or the wealth. It was the feeling that this place was run, like someone was actually in charge of the basics. In a lot of 16th century cities across Europe, daily life came with a certain background grime. Streets could be narrow and crowded. Waste often ended up close to where people lived. Water could be a gamble. And that's why Tenochtitlan hit so hard. Here, the water wasn't just scenery, it was managed, and the city behaved as if cleanliness was part of civic order, not a private hobby. The first thing to understand is that a lake city can't afford to be careless. If you dump filth into the same waters you travel on, fish in, and farm beside, the consequences come back fast. So there are rules, and there's enforcement. Waste is collected and moved out rather than left to rot in the streets. Latrines exist, not as a luxury, but as a practical necessity. People sweep, they maintain canals, they dredge. And the fact that outsiders noticed this tells you it wasn't subtle. It was visible enough to register even through culture shock. The scale of that maintenance is part of the story. Some historians have estimated that roughly 1,000 people were employed every day just to keep streets and public spaces clean. And even if the exact number is debated, the point is clear. This wasn't occasional tidying, it was a system with staffing. Clean water is the centerpiece. The aqueduct from Chapultepec brings fresh water into the city, and it does it in a way that aims for reliability. 2 channels mean maintenance doesn't shut the whole system down. One line can keep flowing while the other is cleared. That's not just clever, it's an attitude. It says, we expect this city to keep working every day, and we plan for the boring problems that would otherwise cripple it. Then there's the human side. Hygiene is not framed as something only the elite care about. Bathing is common and not treated as strange. The sources describe frequent washing, steam baths, and a level of comfort with water that makes sense in a world built on canals. Moctezuma II becomes a symbol in these stories, partly because he's an easy figure for outsiders to focus on. They describe him bathing often, changing clothes frequently, and expecting a controlled, orderly environment around him. You can treat that as courtly luxury, but it also reflects something wider. The ruler's habits only make sense in a culture where cleanliness already carries social meaning. Otherwise, it would feel like an eccentric obsession. And now imagine the sensory clash when the Spaniards finally entered the city. They'd been on the move for months. Leather, sweat, damp clothing, bodies that hadn't seen a proper wash in a long time. Meanwhile, people around them are burning fragrant resins and incense, making the air sweet. A Spaniard might assume in that moment that the scent is a kind of reverence, that it's being offered to them as if they're something sacred. But there's another possibility that fits the daily culture better. The fragrance may have been practical, even defensive, a way to cover what they experienced as an unbearable stench from exhausted strangers who, by local standards, smelled like unwashed barbarians. Public spaces reinforce the point. Markets are regulated, streets and plazas are maintained. Even the flow of people has a kind of choreography, because movement on causeways and in canals is constantly intersecting. That requires discipline. And discipline, in a city like this, shows up as cleanliness, because filth is disorder you can smell. The comparison with European cities is always tricky because it can slide into bragging or into caricature. But the contrast does help you understand why the Spaniards were so stunned. They weren't arriving from some sterile utopia. They were arriving from a world where many cities struggled with basic sanitation, especially as populations grew and infrastructure lagged behind. In Tenochtitlan, infrastructure is the story. The aqueducts matter, the canals matter, the routines matter, the rules matter. And there's a practical intelligence underneath it. Cleanliness here isn't only about comfort, it's about keeping the city alive. It protects the chinampa system. It protects transport routes. It reduces the risks that come when too many people live too close together. And it also communicates something political. A clean city signals control. It tells residents and visitors that the state can organize labor, enforce norms, and shape everyday life. That can feel comforting if you're inside the system. It can feel intimidating if you're outside it. There's one more layer that's easy to miss. Cleanliness in Tenochtitlan is also aesthetic. The city is built to be looked at. Canals reflect buildings. Whitewashed surfaces catch light. Order reads as beauty. So when the Spaniards talk about the city as if it's unreal, they're responding to a real design principle. This place is meant to project stability. And stability in a lake environment is never free. It's purchased with constant work. Sweepers, dredgers, collectors, inspectors, builders. A whole workforce dedicated to the unglamorous tasks that keep a metropolis from collapsing into its own waste. If you want a simple way to say it, it's this. Tenochtitlan treated cleanliness as infrastructure, not as an afterthought, not as a personal quirk, but as one of the systems that made the city possible in the first place. You can learn a lot about a civilization by watching what it buys and where it buys it. In Tenochtitlan, the clearest window into everyday life isn't a palace or a temple, it's the market at Tlatelolco. This isn't a side street with a few stalls, it's a vast, organized space where thousands of people move with purpose, where prices are understood, where disputes are settled, where information travels faster than any official messenger. On major market days, which come on a steady cycle, some accounts and later estimates put the crowd at 40 to 60,000 people. That's the kind of number that forces you to recalibrate, because it's not just busy, it's an event large enough to rival the population of many European cities of the same era. Spanish witnesses keep coming back to the same point. The scale felt unreal, not only because of the crowds, but because it worked. Goods were grouped, rules were enforced, and order wasn't polite or slow. There were courts right there in the market, and judges weren't just listening like neutral referees. They could issue decisions on the spot. The justice system had a reputation for being fast and harsh, and whatever you think of that, it helps explain why strangers could make deals all day without the whole place turning into theft and brawls. The market wasn't only a place to exchange objects, it was a place to exchange trust, backed by authority you could see. One thing that surprises outsiders is that you don't need minted coins for a market economy to function. Here, value is carried in things people agree on. Cacao beans work as a small unit, the kind of thing you can count out for everyday purchases. For larger deals, you can use quills filled with gold dust, or standardized textiles, or other high-value goods that are widely recognized. It isn't primitive, it's practical. Minted coinage isn't the only way to build an economy. What matters is shared confidence that a certain item will be accepted tomorrow the same way it's accepted today. And in Tlatelolco, you can see that confidence in motion. The variety of goods is the next shock. Food is everywhere, but it's not just survival food. You see fresh vegetables from chinampas, piles of maize, beans, squash, chiles, tomatoes, fruit, herbs, honey. You see fish and waterfowl from the lake, and you see salt, which matters more than people realize because it's preservation and flavor and trade leverage. You see textiles, cotton cloth, cloaks in different qualities that signal status without anyone saying a word. You see obsidian blades, tools, needles, pottery, baskets, mats, ropes, pigments, feathers, carved stone, wooden goods. And then you realize what the market is really showing you. This city is plugged into a huge geographic network. Goods are arriving from hot coasts and cool highlands, from forests, deserts, and river valleys. Some of it is ordinary trade, some of it is tribute. But either way, it means roads, ports, storage, accounting, and the political muscle to keep routes open. The people who make that network hum include the pochateca, the long-distance merchants, who are more than merchants. They travel far, they negotiate access, they learn local conditions, and they bring back not only goods, but intelligence. In many empires, spies are invisible. Here, they can be hiding in sight plain, because a trader has a natural reason to ask questions. What's happening in that city? Who is angry at whom? Which ruler is sick? Which road is unsafe? The pochateca move through the world collecting the kind of small details that become strategic when you're managing power across distance. And inside Tlatelolco, you can feel how that information would circulate. Markets create gossip, and gossip becomes knowledge. There's also a social lesson embedded in the market's layout. This is not a free-for-all, it's regulated, which means the state is present even in buying and selling. Standards matter, measures matter, behavior matters. If you cheat, there are consequences, and the consequences can be immediate. That kind of order doesn't happen by accident. It requires authority people recognize, and it requires enough trust in that authority that strangers will do business together. So when you picture the market, don't picture chaos. Picture a city-sized conversation with rules. Picture a place where a farmer from the lake zone can sell produce next to someone offering cacao from the south, next to a craftsman shaping obsidian, next to a seller of bright feathers that will end up on a noble's cloak, next to a broker arranging something bigger than a household purchase. And remember what this does for the capital. It feeds the city, literally, but it also feeds it socially. It gives people a shared space where the empire becomes tangible, where you can touch goods from far away and feel connected to something larger. It also creates dependencies. A city that relies on huge daily markets is strong when routes are open. It becomes fragile when routes are cut. That fragility will matter later when war turns infrastructure into a weapon. And the sound of it all is part of the evidence. Spanish observers said the hum of Tlatelolco carried for miles, a low, steady roar made of bargaining voices, foot traffic, canoes docking, porters shifting loads, judges calling order, buyers comparing, sellers calling out, and behind it all, a simple truth. You can build temples and palaces, but if you can't organize exchange, you don't have a capital. You have a monument. Before anything else, it helps to accept a basic fact about this world. Religion isn't a private corner of life. It's the frame around reality. And for the Mexica, that frame is built on debt, motion, and a universe that can fail if people stop doing their part. In their stories, the cosmos isn't guaranteed. The sun doesn't rise just because it's polite. It rises because forces keep it moving, and those forces demand nourishment. Huitzilopochtli, the god tied to the sun and to war, isn't a distant symbol in this logic. He's imagined as a fighter who needs to be fed so he can push through the darkness each night and still have the strength to return in the morning. Many researchers describe this as a kind of sacred economy. Humans receive life, heat, rain, crops, and in return they owe something back, not as symbolism, but as survival logic. That's the mental terrain you have to step onto, because otherwise sacrifice looks like random cruelty, and that's not how it functioned inside the system. Still, there's no reason to soften what it was. People were killed in rituals, blood was offered, hearts were taken, and for the state, these ceremonies weren't only spiritual acts, they were public performances that reinforced order, hierarchy, and fear. The hard part is figuring out scale and meaning without falling into either extreme, because the sources are loaded. Spanish chroniclers wrote with agendas. Some were shocked, some were trying to justify conquest, some were selling a story back home, and all of them were filtering what they saw through a moral lens that left little room for nuance. But archaeology also exists, and it doesn't politely agree with every Spanish exaggeration, nor does it erase the violence. It does what good evidence does. It anchors the debate in physical reality. That Tzompantli is a good example. For a long time, the skull rack was treated in popular retellings like a horror prop, either inflated into fantasy or dismissed as propaganda. Then, excavations in Mexico City uncovered remains consistent with large-scale skull displays near the ceremonial precinct, including mortar-bound skulls in structures associated with these displays. That doesn't mean every dramatic number in the chronicles is correct. It does mean the practice was real, visible, and central enough to leave heavy traces. So the question shifts from did it happen to why did it happen and what did it do for society? One answer is theological. In Mexica thought, blood carries vitality. It's not just fluid, it's force. Giving that force to the gods helps keep cosmic processes running, especially the sun. Another answer is political. A state that can take captives, stage a ritual, and do it in front of thousands is demonstrating control. It's also turning warfare into a supply chain, where successful campaigns feed not only tribute, but ceremonies that renew legitimacy. And it goes further than just showing off in some abstract way. These events could be staged as psychological warfare. Visiting leaders, ambassadors, and representatives from rival or hostile cities could be invited, given prominent places to sit, and made to watch the machinery up close. The message writes itself without anyone having to say it out loud. Look at our resources. Look at the crowds we can command. Look at how close we stand to the gods. And then the quieter threat hanging underneath it. You could be next. That doesn't make the system less brutal, but it does make it more intelligible as strategy. It's not only fanaticism, it's statecraft performed as ritual. That leads to the concept of the so-called flowery wars, which are often described as staged conflicts designed to capture prisoners rather than seize territory. The evidence suggests this idea has a basis in real practices and political relationships, but it also wasn't a neat, single-purpose institution that worked the same way everywhere and always. Sometimes combat could be limited and ritualized. Sometimes it was brutal and strategic. What seems consistent is that taking captives had high value, and that value shaped how people fought, trained, and understood honor. It also shaped how outsiders interpreted what they were seeing, because a European soldier expects war to be about land and surrender, while here, war can also be about bodies as offerings, and that's a different moral universe. There's another detail worth holding on to, because it changes the tone. Sacrifice wasn't only about killing. There were many forms of offering, including bloodletting by elites, fasting, self-denial, and ritual obligations that didn't involve death. Human sacrifice is the most extreme and the most memorable, but it's sitting inside a broader ritual life that is constant and structured, with calendars, festivals, and roles that knit society together. When the state escalates sacrifice, it's not inventing violence from nothing. It's drawing on a language everyone already speaks, then amplifying it in ways that serve power. And yes, that power could be terrifying for subject peoples, especially when tribute, intimidation, and ritual spectacle blended together. But it's also important not to flatten the Mexica into a single stereotype, because their world includes art, law, engineering, trade, education, and philosophical traditions too. A society can be sophisticated and violent at the same time. That's not a loophole, it's a human pattern. If you want to be careful and honest, you end up with something like this. The evidence strongly supports that ritual killing and large-scale displays existed in and around the ceremonial center, and that they were meaningful within Mexica cosmology and politics. The Spanish accounts are valuable, but shaped by shock, ideology, and the needs of conquest. Archaeology helps correct the most extreme claims while confirming the underlying reality. And the practices made sense to participants as a duty that maintained the world, even as they inflicted real suffering on real people. Once you see it that way, the subject becomes less like a lurid side plot and more like a central mechanism of how the state explained itself, how it justified war, and how it tried to keep the sun moving day after day in a universe that, to them, was always one mistake away from darkness. If you want to understand how Tenochtitlan could build so much, fight so often, and still feel orderly, you have to look at who was allowed to do what and how people were trained to accept that order as normal. This society is not pretending everyone is equal. Rank is everywhere. You can see it in clothing, in jewelry, in hairstyles, in who can wear certain feathers or certain sandals, in who can drink what, and who can speak in which spaces. Status isn't only personal pride, it's a public language, and it keeps the machine from wobbling. At the top are the nobles, the populated, families tied to power, land, and privilege. Below them are commoners, the masquewaltin, who do most of the labor, farming, building, carrying, and fighting. There are also people in various dependent positions, including forms of servitude that don't map neatly onto European ideas of slavery, but still involve constraint, sale, and punishment. The point isn't to force perfect categories. The point is that society is structured, and the structure is reinforced every day. Education is one of the clearest examples, because it tells you the state is shaping minds, not just collecting tribute. Children don't just grow up and hope for the best. They're pushed into institutions that teach them their place and their duties. For many commoner boys, that means the Tlatelolco, the youth house, where training leans hard into discipline, endurance, collective labor, and military readiness. It's not only about learning to fight, it's about learning to obey, to move with others, to tolerate discomfort, to carry loads, to build, to show up. For the elite, there's the Calmicac, a more rarefied school tied to temples and leadership, where students learn ritual knowledge, history, administration, speaking skills, and the kind of self-control expected from people who will command. This isn't simply education as personal improvement, it's education as state infrastructure. It produces officers, priests, scribes, and administrators who can manage a large, demanding capital. And it produces a population trained to accept hierarchy as something taught, rehearsed, and enforced. Over this structure sits the Huey Tlatoani, the Great Speaker. The title matters because it frames leadership as voice and judgment, not just brute force. He is not merely a king who inherits a throne and does whatever he wants. He is the center of a political and religious web, chosen from a royal line, expected to embody authority, to preside over ritual, to lead campaigns, to reward allies, and to punish disobedience. Power is personal, but it's also institutional. Councils exist, nobles compete, factions form. The ruler has to navigate that, and the city watches closely, because the whole system depends on confidence that the top is steady. The distance around the ruler is not accidental. It's enforced through etiquette that turns power into atmosphere. Even the highest nobles, men with their own wealth and prestige, were expected to enter Moctezuma's presence barefoot and in plain cloaks, hiding the signs of their status as a kind of performed humility, so the contrast between them and the ruler stayed sharp. That brings us to Moctezuma II, a figure who attracts extremes. In some stories, he's a philosopher king, refined, deeply religious, almost too thoughtful for the crisis coming toward him. In other stories, he's portrayed as hesitant, indecisive, trapped by superstition or ritual caution. The evidence suggests a more complicated picture. He inherits a powerful state with real enemies and fragile alliances. He also inherits expectations of how a ruler should behave, how he should speak, how he should appear, and what kinds of decisions are considered legitimate. When outsiders describe him as distant or ceremonial, that may be partly true, but it may also be them misreading a political style where the ruler's distance is part of the job, because sacred authority needs space around it. He is surrounded by feathers and gold not only because he likes luxury, but because the spectacle is political technology. It tells everyone, including rivals, that the center holds. It tells commoners that the hierarchy is real. It tells nobles that the prize is worth competing for. And it tells foreign visitors that they're entering a world where authority is staged as something almost natural. And those feathers aren't a casual decoration. At the palace there was a great aviary, the Totokali, where birds were kept and cared for at scale, with hundreds of attendants whose job was simply to maintain a lively supply of brilliant plumage, so the ruler's symbols could be renewed again and again without interruption. But that staging has a cost. A system built on ritualized distance can be slow to adapt when the situation demands improvisation. A ruler trained to weigh omens, rituals, alliances, and precedent may hesitate when faced with something that doesn't fit existing categories. That doesn't automatically make him weak, it makes him human inside his own rules. So when you ask whether Moctezuma was a philosopher king or a weak leader, the most honest answer may be that he was a ruler built for a particular kind of world, and he was forced to make decisions in a moment when that world was changing faster than any institution could comfortably handle. In 1519, the shoreline stops being a border and starts being a doorway. Hernán Cortés arrives on the Gulf Coast with a small force by any imperial standard, but with a talent for reading fractures and a willingness to gamble on them. From the beginning, this isn't a simple march toward a capital. It's a negotiation with a whole landscape of rival cities, old grudges, tribute obligations, and resentments that have been building for years. The Mexica world is powerful, but it isn't a single smooth block. It's a network, and networks have weak points. Cortés learns quickly that the most important resource he can collect is not gold, but allies. Along the way, he gains translators, including Malintzin, known as Doña Marina, whose role is often reduced to a symbol when it's actually something more immediate and practical. Language becomes leverage, and leverage becomes survival. Messages that would be impossible become possible. Intentions can be disguised or clarified. Threats can be softened into diplomacy, and diplomacy can be sharpened into threat. As the Spaniards move inland, they enter a world where war and politics are intertwined, where a city's status is measured not only by its walls, but by its relationships, and where memory matters, because people remember who took their children for tribute, who demanded labor, who humiliated whom in public. This is where the Tlaxcalans come in, and it's hard to overstate how decisive that relationship becomes. Tlaxcala is a rival power, encircled and pressured, hostile to Mexica dominance, and experienced in fighting it. When the Spaniards first meet them, it's not friendship. There's blood, testing, distrust, and a slow realization on both sides that an alliance could be useful. For the Spaniards, Tlaxcala offers numbers, local knowledge, and the ability to move through the region without being crushed immediately. For the Tlaxcalans, the Spaniards look like a weapon that might finally break a balance that has kept them under constant threat. It's not a clean partnership, it's a hard bargain shaped by self-interest. But it becomes the quiet engine behind everything that follows, because it turns a foreign expedition into a coalition. Then there's the famous question everyone circles. Did the Mexica think the Spaniards were gods? The story often gets told as a single dramatic misunderstanding, with Cortés stepping into a role like an actor handed the perfect costume. The problem is that the evidence doesn't sit neatly in that shape. Many researchers think "they thought he was Quetzalcoatl" idea was amplified later, shaped by Spanish needs and by the way people retold events after catastrophe. That doesn't mean religion and prophecy played no role. They did. Omens, portents, sacred calendars, and the authority of signs were part of how decisions were framed. But treating the Mexica leadership as naive believers who simply mistook steel and horses for divinity misses the political intelligence of a state that had managed enemies for generations. A more careful way to see it is this. Moctezuma and his court faced an unfamiliar threat, and in an unfamiliar situation, you reach for familiar categories. You test, you watch, you send gifts, you try to contain the problem with protocol, and you also keep options open, because killing strangers can create consequences, but welcoming them can create a different kind of danger. The gifts themselves are revealing. They are often described as lavish, and they probably were, but they're not only generosity. They're a measuring tool, a way to read the stranger's desires and limits, and maybe a way to bind them into obligations. In this world, exchange is never just exchange, it's relationship. Meanwhile, the Spaniards interpret everything through their own mental library. They hear formal speech and translate it into surrender. They see ritual politeness and read it as weakness. They see awe in some faces and decide it must be worship. They are not simply lying, they are processing reality through the assumptions they arrived with, the same way the Mexica are doing on their side. And here's the cruel irony. the hospitality trap hidden inside the city's own brilliance. The Mexica themselves allow the Spaniards to enter Tenochtitlan over those very causeways everyone admired, the engineered lines that made the lake city possible. Once the foreigners are inside, those stone roads stop being simple routes and start acting like threads, narrow lifelines that can be cut, guarded, or pulled on. And Cortés understands that if you control movement on a few raised lines of stone, you can squeeze a metropolis like a hand around a throat. As tensions rise, the materials of war start speaking for themselves. Wooden shields and quilted armor meet steel cuirasses and helmets, and there's a particular sound in the clashes that people remembered, the sharp bite of obsidian against metal, a hard, wrong note, like a weapon realizing the world has changed. In the middle of all this, the alliance politics keep moving. Cities choose sides. Some resist, some cooperate, some try to play both. Rumors run ahead of armies. Stories get sharper each time they're repeated. A capital like Tenochtitlan can feel distant and untouchable, but its power depends on the belief that resistance is hopeless. Once that belief cracks, once people see even a small possibility of a different future, the whole valley becomes louder, more unstable, more ready to shift. By the time Cortés reaches the lake, the collision isn't just between Spaniards and Mexica, it's between systems, between rival indigenous states, between old tribute relationships and new opportunism, between a ceremonial politics built on distance and a foreign style built on improvisation and pressure. And when the causeways finally come into view again, that earlier Mirage has a new edge to it, because now the city on the water isn't only a wonder, it's a target, surrounded by enemies it helped create, facing strangers it doesn't yet know how to classify, in a moment when every gesture can be read as either diplomacy or the opening move of war. It begins with a break in the spell. For a while, the situation balances on ritual and nerves, on meetings, gifts, guarded smiles, and the hope that everyone can get what they want without lighting the city on fire. Then something snaps, and the story turns into escape. The Spaniards try to fight their way out at night, carrying treasure that suddenly feels like a weight you can drown under. Later, people call it the Night of Sorrows, and the name fits not because it's poetic, but because it captures that mix of panic and loss, men slipping on wet stone, bodies falling into canals, shouting in the dark, and the realization that the causeways that guided them in can also trap them in a narrow corridor of death. Even if you strip away the later storytelling, the basic shape is clear. The coalition miscalculates, the city erupts, and Tenochtitlan proves it can bite hard. But the siege that follows is not decided by courage alone, it's decided by systems and by biology. Smallpox arrives, and it doesn't arrive as a dramatic enemy you can point at and fight. It arrives silently, carried by contact, moving through households and neighborhoods, and it tears through a population with no prior exposure. The evidence suggests it kills widely, and it disrupts everything a city depends on: labor, leadership, caregiving, food distribution, morale. It also hits at the worst possible moment, when the city needs coordination most. In many accounts, the epidemic takes key figures and leaves gaps that can't be patched quickly, and it changes the psychological landscape. When people are dying in huge numbers, the universe can feel as if it's already tipping into disorder, which matters in a culture where cosmic stability is part of political legitimacy. Cortés comes back, but he doesn't come back the same way. He comes back with allies, with a plan to control the lake, and with an understanding that you can't take this city by charging into it. You have to strangle it.
The water that once made Tenochtitlan strong becomes the battlefield. The Spaniards build brigantines, small sailing vessels assembled and launched on the lake, and suddenly the Mexica are facing something new: armored boats carrying cannon and crossbows, able to challenge canoe fleets and control movement between neighborhoods and the mainland. On the water, the fight becomes a contest between speed and firepower, between local knowledge and unfamiliar technology, and between a city's home advantage and the pressure of an enemy willing to turn the environment into a cage. And the first truly lethal move is aimed at thirst.
The attackers damage and cut the Chapultepec aqueduct early in the campaign, and for a city surrounded by brackish water, that isn't an inconvenience, it's a slow death sentence. You can endure fear, you can endure hunger for a while, but once clean water becomes scarce, everything else unravels faster, because sickness spreads, strength collapses, and daily life turns into a search for a sip. Meanwhile, the causeways become front lines. The coalition pushes in along the raised roads, and the defenders respond with a kind of urban resistance that's both desperate and clever. Bridges are broken, channels are widened, ambushes are set, stones rain down, canoes strike from the sides. It's not a simple old weapons versus new weapons story. The Mexica adapt, they learn patterns, they exploit weaknesses. They fight house by house, canal by canal, turning familiarity into a weapon. But the attackers also adapt. They learn to rebuild bridges as they advance. They learn to use the brigantines to protect the flanks of the causeways. They learn that controlling intersections, water gates, and narrow crossings matters more than grand charges. The city's greatest strength, its connectivity, becomes a map for invasion. Cut one canal, hold one bridge, control one causeway break, and the city's districts begin to separate like compartments in a ship taking on water. The siege lasts for weeks, often described as around 80 days in its final phase, and the length matters because it means hunger becomes a weapon. Food routes are disrupted, chinampa zones are threatened, markets shrink, clean water becomes harder to secure, waste builds up, the routines that made the city stable begin to fail. And failing routines aren't just discomfort, they're collapse. People are exhausted, fighting while sick, fighting while hungry, fighting while watching neighborhoods burn and temples crumble. The coalition, meanwhile, is enormous, and that matters too, because it means the conflict is not simply Europeans versus Mexica. It's a civil war across the valley, with indigenous allies doing much of the fighting, carrying much of the burden, and making the siege possible at all. At the end, what breaks the city is not one dramatic moment, it's accumulation, disease, hunger, thirst, water control, relentless pressure, the loss of safe movement, the shrinking of space, and the steady destruction of the environment that kept the city alive. When the last defenses fail, it's less like a fortress being stormed, and more like a living system finally losing too many parts at once. The city that once looked like a mirage on the water becomes, in these final days, a place of smoke, debris, and silence punctuated by screams. And the lake that once carried food and commerce becomes a weapon, a moat, and then a grave. By the time the end comes, it doesn't feel like a clean victory. It feels like a city being dismantled while it's still breathing. Streets that once carried markets and processions are choked with rubble. Canals that once moved food and people are clogged, bridged, or filled in. The ceremonial center, the place designed to project stability, becomes the stage for collapse. Cuauhtémoc, the last ruler, is young, and he inherits the worst possible version of the job: lead a starving, sick, surrounded city with fewer choices every day. When the final defenses fail, the stories converge on one image.
He tries to escape across the lake, not as a coward, but as a leader, searching for a way to keep something alive. He's captured, and the capture is symbolic, because it tells everyone the center is gone. The great speaker has been taken, the voice of the state has been seized. After that, what follows is not only conquest, but transformation by force. The Templo Mayor, the heart of ritual and authority, is torn down, not immediately as a neat demolition, but through the practical logic of conquest. The old sacred center is unacceptable, so it must be broken, and its stones must be reused. That reuse matters. This isn't just destruction for the sake of anger. It's turning the enemy's body into building material. Stone blocks that once faced the gods become foundations for a new order. The new city grows on top of the old one, but it also grows out of it, literally, because the conquerors need the same geography, the same central location, and the same labor networks. And they also inherit the same problem, the lake. Mexico City does not appear on a blank slate. It appears on an island environment with canals, causeways, water management systems, and a stubborn relationship between salt, flood, and human ambition. Over time, much of the lake is drained and filled. Canals are reshaped or erased. The ground is forced to behave like land even when it doesn't want to. The result is a city that constantly sinks, cracks, and floods, a reminder that you can bury a system, but you can't fully erase the environment that made it. And yet, the old city never completely disappears. It survives in fragments, in street lines, in place names, and in literal ruins under your feet. The Zócalo, the great central square, sits in the same broad heart space where the ceremonial precinct once dominated, and beneath nearby buildings, including the area around the cathedral, parts of the Templo Mayor complex remain, stone and sculpture preserved by accident and by burial. That's the strange afterlife of conquest. A city is destroyed and then it is used. The conquerors tried to replace the meaning of the center, but the center's physical gravity remains. The sun that once needed feeding is not the same sun in the new ideology, but the need for a center, for a stage, for a place where power is performed, stays stubbornly familiar. So when you picture the end of Tenochtitlan, don't picture a clean before and after. Picture a messy overlap. Mud, rubble, and new walls rising from old stones. Survivors navigating a world where their streets have new names and their sacred places have new meanings. And underneath it all, the lake still there in memory and in soil, waiting, as it always has, to remind anyone who builds on it that water never truly forgets.
What lasts after a city like this is destroyed isn't only stone. Its habits, stories, and the shape of problems that refuse to go away. Tenochtitlan disappears as a political center, but it doesn't vanish as an idea because it left behind a blueprint for how people can live with water, and also a warning about how quickly that relationship can be turned against them. In the decades after the fall, the new order tries to make the old one feel distant, almost unreal, like a bad dream that ended. Temples are replaced, languages are pushed aside, names are changed. And still, the city underneath keeps speaking through the ground. Some of it is literal, in surviving walls and buried sculptures. Some of it is structural in the way the capital remains anchored to the same central space because geography doesn't care about ideology. Some of it is human in the fact that life goes on through mixing, adaptation, and the quiet stubbornness of families who learn to survive inside a system they didn't choose. That mixture is the part people often rush past. It's tempting to tell the story as pure replacement, one world ending and another beginning. But the evidence suggests something messier and more intimate. Cultures collide,
And out of that collision comes a new society that carries wounds, compromises, and continuities all at once. Indigenous labor and knowledge keep shaping the city even as new institutions take control. Old foods remain, old roots remain, old skills remain. Even the idea of the marketplace, that daily pulse of exchange, persists in new forms. At the same time, there is real loss. A sacred landscape is broken, a political system is dismantled, people are killed, displaced, and forced into new hierarchies. Memory becomes dangerous, then becomes private, then becomes layered, like sediment in a canal. And yet memory doesn't stop working. It waits. It resurfaces in chronicles, in oral traditions, in art, in the way certain symbols keep returning. The eagle on the cactus survives, not as a museum relic, but as a living emblem, carrying both pride and pain, depending on who is looking at it. The city's engineering legacy is also complicated. On one hand, it's hard not to admire the sheer intelligence of building a metropolis in a lake system, feeding it with chinampas, moving it with canals, supplying it with aqueducts, and maintaining it through daily labor. On the other hand, the later decision to drain and fill the lakes creates its own long-term consequences, because a valley that once absorbed and distributed water becomes a place that struggles with flooding, sinking ground, and a constant fight against the environment. In that sense, the ghost of Tenochtitlan isn't only an archaeological site, it's a set of questions still sitting under the modern city. Where does the water go? How do you keep it clean? How do you feed millions without breaking the land? How do you build on ground that shifts? Those aren't romantic questions, they're practical, and they connect the past to the present in a way that feels almost unfairly direct. There's also the moral legacy, and this is where the story can't end with simple comfort. The Mexica state was capable of extraordinary organization, beauty, and intellectual life. It was also capable of coercion and violence at scale. The Spanish conquest brought its own forms of violence, exploitation, and upheaval, and it did not simply end cruelty. It rearranged it, justified it differently, and spread it through new institutions. If you look for a clean moral scoreboard, you end up missing the human reality, which is that large systems, in many places and times, tend to demand suffering from someone. The more useful question is what the story reveals about fragility. A city that seemed like a dream on the water depended on routines that had to be renewed every day. It depended on alliances that could flip. It depended on water systems that could be cut. It depended on health in a world where disease could arrive and rewrite the rules. And it depended on the belief that the center would hold. Once enough of those supports failed, the fall wasn't slow. It was sudden, cascading, and irreversible. That's why Tenochtitlan still matters. Not because it's a perfect lost world, and not because it's a simple horror story, but because it shows what humans can build when they take an environment seriously, and what can happen when power, fear, and misunderstanding turn that environment into a weapon. It's the memory of a city that once made outsiders think they were dreaming, and then made everyone who lived there learn in the hardest possible way how quickly a dream can be turned into mud. Thank you so much for watching our video and supporting the channel. See you in the next episodes, and good night.